Good evening, everyone. My name is Arkan Fung, and I'm the Academic Dean at the Kennedy School. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this evening's IOP Forum. We have a very special guest tonight, Ameenah Gurib Fakim, the President of Mauritius. Serving since 2015, she has the very rare distinction of being both a head of state and highly accomplished scientist. We can kind of take a poll later on, but evidently there are others. Angela Merkel, who's a physicist, and then Margaret Thatcher, who was a chemist. All women. I think there's a pattern here. The name I came up with was Jimmy Carter, but he was only an engineer. A scientist by training, she holds a PhD in chemistry from the University of Exeter. Before entering politics and public service, she served for many years as a professor of organic chemistry at the University of Mauritius. She later founded the Center for International Development and Pharmacology, Research and Innovation, and served as its managing director. Before that, she served as Dean of the Faculty of Science and Pro-Vice Chancellor of the university there. She's a founding member of the Pan-African Association of African Medicinal Plants, and she co-authored the first ever African Herbal Pharmacopedia. She has authored or co-edited 28 books and several book chapters and many articles in the field of biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable development. She received in 2007 the L'Oreal UNESCO Prize for Women in Science and the laureate of the National Economic and Social Council. She is recipient of the special prize from the CTA, NEPAD, and the African Union Commission Award for Women in Science, both in 2009. She was nominated to serve as the presidential candidate of the dominant Alliance Le POP, which is an alliance between the Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Party, and the Mouvement Libertaire. And then, my understanding is that the opposition leader also welcomed her nomination, and her presidency was approved unanimously in the National Assembly. I'm told that Mauritius is not typically so consensual in its politics, but at that moment anyway, far less contentious than the politics of the United States right now. She's been a champion of Africa, of science, of biodiversity, and of women in science. She said, "We believe in a scientifically independent Africa that is one with science, technology, and innovation fully embedded in governmental policies and priorities, delivered by properly resourced and empowered educational institutions. A scientifically independent Africa will have both the ability to train and keep brilliant scientists on the continent and create an inspiring new generation of academic leaders. Ultimately, we believe scientific independence means that African problems can be solved by African-led solutions." She's also said that biodiversity and indigenous knowledge systems underpin life on Earth. Africa's unique biodiversity will continue to offer humankind new leads in medicine, provided that we conserve, document, and validate traditional knowledge associated with medicinal plants. On June the 5th, 2015, she was sworn in as the 6th president and first female president of Mauritius. She's the 4th woman to serve as a head of state in Africa, all of Africa. Please welcome Her Excellency Ameenah Gurib Fakim, President of Mauritius.
President, the Board of Trustees, the faculty, students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm indeed honored to be today at one of the finest institutions of learning. The legacy and record of academic excellence that Harvard University has achieved is exemplary, one to be admired, and wherever possible, emulated around the world. At the outset, I have a confession to make. As soon as I told my family that I was going to Harvard, at the invitation of President Faust, my daughter, Iman, who is an undergrad in the UK and present here, said simply and firmly, "I'm coming." So we are both glad to be here in one of the most hallowed portals of excellence, of academic excellence, and are grateful for this opportunity. As an African leader who is first a scientist, I use my bully pulpit to champion the cause of science for development, and I'm devoting my tenure to promoting scientific excellence on the continent. So I see my visit as an opportunity to learn as well as to share our thinking on how tiny Mauritius can overcome the tyranny of geography and location in the vastness of the Indian Ocean and punch above its size and participate in continental affairs. Friends, this task is a work in progress, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity of sharing a few facets of our development story. Ladies and gentlemen, we meet at a consequential time in Africa's evolution. Africa, south of the Sahara, is undergoing unprecedented economic, social, and cultural transformations. In 2010, the McKinsey Global Institute described African economies as the line on the move. Perceptions of Africa have changed dramatically over the past 20 years. Frequently viewed as from an Afro-pessimist lens, the continent can be seen as a locus of wars, famine, and entrenched poverty in the 1990s. Fortunately, there is now a focus on Africa rising, and even talk of an African 21st century. This is largely attributed to the commodities boom, improved governance, sound macroeconomic fundamentals, commitment to reform, and in new resource discoveries, which have all contributed to robust growth trends and have helped to reverse 20 years of economic decline that began in the 1970s and the 1980s. According to the World Bank, economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa is forecast to grow at 2.9% in 2017 and hopefully rise to above 3.5% by 2018. Our continent needs robust, inclusive, and sustainable growth to meet poverty targets. Sub-Saharan Africa is open for business. The Doing Business report in 2016 showed that Sub-Saharan Africa accounted for about 30% of the improved global regulatory reform and half of the world's top 10 improvers. I would like to cite a few numbers about Mauritius. Ours is a small middle-income country with a population of 1.3 million and a per capita gross national income of something like $9,780. In 2016, economic growth registered at 3.8%, and Mauritius Human Development Index ranking of 49. Mauritius performed best in the areas of protecting minority investors and dealing with construction permits with a rank of 32 and 33 respectively. We're also number 1 for ease of doing business on the continent. The overall welcome trends in sub-Saharan Africa has to be seen against the backdrop of sobering facts making the proverbial glass half full. Across the continent, changes in demography, high population growth rates, rapid urbanization, slumping commodity prices, and plummeting oil revenues are all posing major challenges, denting growth, threatening to reverse hard-won development gains. And I would be remiss if I did not address climate change and the fundamental threat it poses to balanced development in sub-Saharan Africa. Food production in sub-Saharan Africa needs to increase by 60% over the next 15 years, and the agriculture sector will be hit hardest. Without adaptation, Africa will suffer severe yield declines in important food-growing areas, for example, maize-growing areas across southern Africa. Rain volatility is on the rise, particularly in the hyper-arid areas of the Sahelian zone. Extreme weather events, droughts in Eastern Africa, floods and cyclones in Southern Africa are increasing in frequency as well as in intensity. Ladies and gentlemen, this is only a fleeting snapshot of the major challenges facing our continent. There are more. And as a scientist, I lament that sub-Saharan Africa, with 12% of the global population, only accounts for less than 1% of the world's research output. OECD members have 12 times per capita the number of scientists and engineers working in research and development as compared to low-income countries. They also publish 25 times more, many in top scientific journal articles. Lamentably, no African nation was among the top 20 countries filing for patent application in 2013. In the short time available, I have painted a broad canvas about the development challenges confronting sub-Saharan Africa as it marches forward for achieving the SDGs by 2030. We have the resources to accelerate our socio-economic transformation, notably a young population, which represents a growing labor force, not only for Africa, but potentially for the rest of the world. By 2034, the continent is predicted to be home to the world's largest working-age population of 1.1 billion. Reaping this potential demographic dividend will require sustained people-centered investment to shape an innovative workforce that can help the economies to advance towards knowledge-intensive economies. Why is it important to attract the youth? Sub-Saharan Africa has the advantage of 11 million young people entering the job market every year, representing unrivaled brain power. Let me cite an example from the world of science. By the age 23, Isaac Newton had made 3 of the greatest discoveries in science: the differential calculus, the composition of light, and the laws of gravitation. All this when in the summer of 1665, his academic base in the other Cambridge, across the pond, had to be evacuated on account of the plague. Friends, the development challenges confronting sub-Saharan Africa far surpass the capability of any country to tackle them alone. To be able to effectively meet our development challenges, Africa must bridge the gap between research and policy making. In September 2015, world leaders adopted 7 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and helped set a bold new development agenda for the next 15 years. I believe now is the time to rededicate ourselves to achieving these goals by 2030. African researchers have a significant one to play in achieving these roles. A highly skilled pool of trained African researchers is the prerequisite for innovation and attracting high-value manufacturing, which in turn drives sustainable economic growth while protecting our planet and addressing climate change. This is what Africa needs to sustain its growth path. We are starting, albeit from a low base. Africa represents 15% of now the global population, but just 1.3% of the global investment in R&D. Low enrollment rates, especially in tertiary higher education institutions, mean we're not creating the skilled workforce fast enough. This spills into science, with only a few graduating with degrees from the field. Consequently, our scientific workforce remains low at 198 researchers per million population compared to 4,500 in the US. These challenges collectively slow down the development, translation, and use of scientific discoveries to address the myriad of development challenges that impair the everyday lives of millions of Africans. But hope springs eternal. We have compelling ground for optimism as public and private sectors ramp up scientific investment in the coming years. The continent's economic growth can be attributed to the rise in a new generation of political leaders who are technically trained and passionate about promoting governance and creating the democratic spaces for economies to thrive. Consequently, this has continued to attract foreign direct investment, some of which has translated into private sector investment in research and development. Tax incentives provided by Mauritius, South Africa, and other countries are also incentivizing private sector investment in R&D. The spread of mobile phones has ensured African economies are positioned to benefit from technological advances, as we have seen in Kenya, where the introduction of M-Pesa has turned the East African country into a global leader in mobile payment. 2 weeks ago, Kenyans began to participate in the stock markets and are buying and selling shares on their mobile phones. In addition, more of Africa's citizens are accessing smartphones and internet services, with the adoption rate expected to increase to 50% in 2020 from only 2% in 2010. This has also enabled scientific collaboration, leading to the production of cutting-edge research, especially in the health sector, among many US universities and laboratories across the continent. For decades, the notion of controlling or ending the HIV/AIDS pandemic has been a distant aspiration. Through the contribution of African Research Institute in partnership with Harvard Research Group, we now have scientifically validated prevention strategies suggesting that victory against AIDS pandemic is feasible. Recent prevention research provides potent new modalities to complement older prevention tools. One example is the HIV Prevention Trial Network based at sites in multiple African countries. It determined the effectiveness of early versus later treatment strategies in preventing HIV transmission. Participating countries include Malawi, Botswana, Kenya, and Zambia, and the results were dramatic. A 96% reduction in HIV transmission for participants who receive ART immediately as compared to those participants from whom ART was delayed. The journal Science selected this achievement as the 2011 breakthrough of the year. The success of the HIV Prevention Trial Network demonstrates the importance of collaboration, and as an African proverb goes, to go fast, walk alone, to go far, walk together. We wish to strengthen existing partnership and forge new ones that will carry the continent's science agenda forward and promote a shift in the center of gravity of African science to Africa, and we have noted with the creation of the African Agency of Science, Academy of Sciences, and the NEPAD Agencies Alliance for Accelerating Science in Africa, AISA. Key funders, such as the UK's Department for International Development, the Wellcome Trust, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have delegated key programs to the narrow-based AISA platform, granting the platform leadership in decision-making for better mobilizing African science, technology, and innovation to the continent's development needs. This momentum must and should continue. The time is ripe to support a decisive shift in the center of gravity of leadership, governance, and funding of African research, with the leaders of African public, private, philanthropic sectors embracing ownership and informing policies. It is in this context that I've helped found Coalition for African Research and Innovation, CARI, which will mobilize public, private, and philanthropic partnership to connect with and support science, technology, innovation for Africa's development needs. It is through such partnership that Mauritius can provide an important facilitating role to bridge the world of high science and marshal innovation for achieving solid development outcomes. The newly formed CARI is an alliance of African science leaders, the private sector, the international funders, including AISA, the Wellcome Trust, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and also the US National Institute of Health, all of whom have joined forces to catalyze investment in research and innovation. Our aim is to ensure that scientists on the continent are an effective force for R&D data generation, policy making, and economic development, and nurture the generation of scientists who can lead Africa's transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is no secret that we are facing uncertain times in global politics, which could negatively impact a rising Africa. Economic populism, inward-looking policies, cuts in foreign aid, and worrisome anti-science sentiments are all taking a toll on the existing order. Given that these trends could lead to a decline in international funding for science in Africa, I have been at pains to highlight the need for Africa to own her development agenda and shape her destiny by making investment in science, technology, and innovation a priority. This can only happen if we mobilize our resources for knowledge generation supporting tertiary education, nurture scientists, and bridge tertiary education and bridge the research uptake gap. We recognize that we cannot do this alone, and we seek partnerships that are anchored in the common good. Here, I would like to conclude to cite the writings of Rabindranath Tagore, India's famous literary giant, poet, Nobel laureate, who described the quest for a promised land in his magisterial poem, Gitanjali, and I quote, "Where the mind is held without fear, and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where word comes from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arm toward perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the desert sand of dead habits, where the mind is led into ever-widening thought and action, into the heaven of freedom. Let my country awake, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, Tagore's aspiration for his country are extremely relevant. I believe that if Africa is to awaken to its unfulfilled potential, science, supported by a new, more hopeful Africa-centered narrative, can help us propel us forward in a journey to achieving the SDGs by 2030 and eliminating the blight of poverty, hunger, and environmental degradation on the face of the continent. Our time for action is now. Thank you for your invitation and for your attention. And now I can say that I have been to Harvard, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Your Excellency. So now it's time for some questions and answers. For those of you who've been to the forum, you know the ground rules. For those of you who haven't, all questioners must identify themselves. One brief question per questioner, that is one per customer. And please, all questions end with a question mark. And you'll note that there are 4 microphones, 2 on the ground floor and 2 up on the balconies there. And if you line up, I will call on you so you may ask your question. Yes, sir.
Hello. My name is Jack Stone, and I'm a sophomore at the college. What do you see the role of women in science?
If I will come up with a cliche just to explain my thoughts, if you have a soccer match and you eliminate 52% of its team, the chances of you succeeding will be very, very small. So we can no longer afford to eliminate 52% of capacity, 52% of intuition, 52% of talent, and 52% of doing things differently. Women have a different way of looking at problems, and I think we are in a stage where we can no longer afford to ignore that. And if you look at the African continent, we look at one sector, we look at agriculture, we find that it's women that feed the continent. So it's time now to empower her with the tools, with whatever tools that there will be, for example, access to cash, access to land, property, all these, you name it. But more importantly, access to the technology. Because if she has to perform agricultural practices correctly, and with the impact of climate change, of course, changing weather pattern and all the rest of it, she has to be empowered. So this is an area, for example, where it comes straight to mind. But we need this workforce, and we need to ensure that we actually impart in her the confidence to move. And this confidence doesn't come later. It comes earlier in the days when she's growing up as a girl child. And we have to make sure that the necessary environment is there for her to prosper. So it goes without saying that we need women.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Yes.
Hi,
sir.
my name is Ryan and I'm a sophomore at the college. I was wondering what you would like your legacy to be once you've left the office of president.
I will cite what President Obama had said recently when he visited Africa. He said, the continent needs strong institutions. The continent doesn't need strong men or women for that matter. So I think what the legacy of, if I may use the word, an African leader, or an average leader, is to ensure that the legacy is there in terms of building our institutions. Why this institution we're here has such a prestigious, fantastic reputation across the world for whatever excellence it has achieved. It didn't achieve it just like this, because the founding fathers have ensured that, they recruit guardian of the reputation of the institution. So it is this kind of mentality that we have to do. Now, the next question you probably be asking, whether it's 1 term or 2 term, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. even in one term, if you do the appropriate mentoring, if you bring in the necessary talented people, and if you actually instill in them this idea that it is possible, you can do things, you can make things happen. So this mentoring is very, very important. So for me, to put it very, very in a nutshell, it's how best we have left the institution in place. And that's a very, very important, it's a huge responsibility, and we have to tackle that up front.
Thank you. Up here in the balcony.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for being here at HKS. My name is Danielle Feinstein. I'm a second-year MPP student here. And, you know, we have too few female politicians. It's very inspiring. You're being the first elected president of Mauritius. And I just wanted to ask you, we almost had a female president here in our country, so we haven't quite gotten to where you guys are. How can we make more space for women to exercise leadership in those high-ranking fields, and can you offer us any anecdotes from your experience?
Good question.
Tall order. As I said, we will need to flag in all the time the gender issue, but I think to get women to that level, I'm not talking about women in leadership position, because there's a difference. For me, to make a difference, you need to have women in power. Where we are starting from a very low base is that we don't even have sufficient mentors. And to get these women to look up to a mentor, to say, yes, it's been possible. So you need to actually create that space. You need to create these women who will be there in power, showing leadership position, and of course showing also ethical leadership. And this is also very, very important. So the issue, first of all, is to get these women with sufficient self-confidence to come and say, yes, we can, right? And the other thing is to have the mentoring. So it's a huge task. It's a huge task. But I think there's another thing as well that we also have to see is, how do we change mindset? I'll just give you another cliche as well. I mean, you probably, well, most of us here will be in a career path, doing, of course, dedicated to the job that we do. If the husband comes home late, people will say, oh, he's a very dedicated, very hardworking young man or gentleman or whatever it is. But if a woman comes home late, and who's looking after the kids? I mean, society expects that woman to be superwoman, because if she does everything for her career, she'll be targeted to be selfish. But at the same time, she's expected to be at home, a perfect mother. So it's time that we look at, in terms of exchange, in terms of sharing of the parental responsibilities. There are some countries that have done it so well. And so it's a huge task ahead of us. But we need to have this solidarity. And here, I'll be tempted also to cite Madeleine Albright. There's a special place in hell for those women who don't help women. So we also have to have this solidarity, because mind you, you'll have enemies. Women have enemies, women themselves. So this is, again, something that we have to be mindful of. So, but we need to develop this culture of saying, yes, I'm going to mentor, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to make sure we take that woman along by the hand and make sure she's there in that space when it matters. Thank you.
Up here in the balcony.
Hi. Hello. My name's Reed McMurtry, and I'm a sophomore at the college. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on the Chinese government's economic interests in Africa and how they've increased their presence on the continent in the past few years. Is this reason to worry for the United States and for democracies that are growing in Africa?
Right, China has had a very interesting history. We've seen, for example, the opening of the Chinese economy with Deng Xiaoping in 1976. It's a country that has remained focused on many things and has developed a culture of hard work. They have a vision, they have ambition. It's the second biggest economy in the world. They have had major inroads in Africa, and rightly, wrongly, it's a whole question of debate. How they've done it, we've seen, for example, in many aspects in terms of the approach to the continent, how they have helped build, for example, the infrastructure. There are good things, there are bad things. Again, it's all open to debate. But there are also the notion that China brings to the table, which we also need to relook at in terms of the work ethics, in terms of family issues, and all these, which is sacred, is sacrosanct in the Chinese culture. At least that's the way we see it in Mauritius. There is no compromise for hard work, and they will work and they will do amazing things. And for us, China is a very important partner. They have helped us tremendously in the past, be it at the level of loans, grants, and many issues in terms of building our infrastructure as well. And we are a country where we are perceived to be increasingly the bridge between Asia and Africa. And for our own development, for our own expansion, economy, and all the rest of it, we see this as a potential to work with China, and the same thing goes for India as well, because they are also two very big players. And we have the advantage of having many people who have come in from these countries to our country. And so we have been using all these, we have been able to leverage all these to establish the partnership with China. But we have to reckon it's the second biggest economy in the world, and it will punch its weight. It will, it will throw its weight around, but we have to be pragmatic of how to handle this. But it's a player, it's here, and we have to work with them.
That's great. I actually have a follow-up question to your question, which is you've laid out a very, very appealing vision of African independence, and in particular African scientific independence. I don't think it's controversial to say that many African states and African societies have not been treated well historically by the countries of the world. And so all sorts of states now and all sorts of companies have interests in science in Africa. So how do you strike the balance between partnering and borrowing from their knowledge and expertise and scientific capability while still nurturing independence, scientific independence of Africans for Africa?
I'll start with the second part, which is the scientific independence. If you look at, we've just given figures, for example, that 12% of humanity or 30% of humanity, we can no longer afford to keep on producing 1.2% of the knowledge. And we don't have the capacity because we've never thought that we have to invest in that space. But now if Africa is going to ensure her development challenges, now let's take a look at the health sector, for example. Now the health sector, we've seen that a lot of work has gone into HIV, a lot of work has gone into malaria, a lot of work has gone into non-communicable diseases like diabetes and all the rest of it. These are great, there have been great results in these, but who takes care of those challenges which are very Africa-centric?
Exactly.
These diseases like
African priorities. Yes.
Yeah, African priorities. And this is where I feel that we have this responsibility to own our challenges, and we need to invest in our people. And this can only be done when the narrative is taken on board by African leaders that they need to put that percentage of per capita into research and development and innovation in African universities. So what we have to do, again, come back to this issue of institution. We need to build these institutions that have the necessary resources, that provide this ecosystem, so that even the diaspora can leverage in the talent and to make it happen on the continent. So the responsibility, we have to speak to ourselves. So have I spoken to both parts of the question?
Yes, I think so. I'm a little concerned about things like intellectual property and exploitation of Africa.
Again, the IP, again, we have to reinforce the existing framework. We have to have institutions that have all the necessary framework to protect the IP. Again, this is something which is deficient, and African researchers, they still have to go outside. But there's also, of course, the cost issue. When you actually file a patent, how much it costs. Now, is the enabling environment there? Are we part of the whole dynamics to do the research work up front so that the cost of filing a patent is much less later on? And this is, again, what we have to learn from the US, where you have the whole entire scheme is geared towards intellectual property. And this is where science has a very important role to play in generating these data and these information. But again, this issue of patent is another issue that we have to consider in another space, because increasingly the research has to be focused on impact. And this is where, again, we stand to benefit from this research. But there's a lot of things happening on the continent, but unfortunately it is not valued enough, it's not protected, it's not disseminated enough. So again, it comes down to us speaking to ourselves and making it happen for us.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I think this question actually adds to your question. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for being with us and being in the Cambridge area. My name is Pelkins. I'm a junior studying mechanical engineering at MIT. I'd like to know, your country actually hosts the African Leadership University, which happens to be one of the hubs of leadership on the continent right now. And I'm curious about your thoughts about the growth and emergence of centers of research and leadership training in other African countries.
Like where else is hopeful?
Yes.
The needs of the continent are so big that wherever it is happening, we have to nurture that so that we rise. But the thing is that we have to be also very careful. When you talk about creating centers of excellence, for me, a center of excellence emerges by virtue of the fact that the work happening there is already excellent. Then you have this center of excellence. But wherever this is happening, ALU, as you have rightly mentioned, in Mauritius is one such example, brought in by a group of talented, very dynamic African leaders, potential leaders, of course, of tomorrow and here already. But we need to nurture that and recognize the input of these people who are trying to make it happen. And this is, again, what we're hoping to do. It's already happening on a small scale with the African Academy of Science, with AISA. I've mentioned the platform. And what we have, again, to do, again, the groundwork has to be established, and this is where I'm doing the advocacy for this, is to bring in these donors or these international bodies, which, of course, are very focused on development issue, as well as Afro-champions. The United States are a very great example of making it, for example, through philanthropy. We've seen two big mega projects, Google and Facebook, happening initially when these young people were there with the idea, getting a check from the philanthropist, registering in Palo Alto, and then the rest is history. This is the kind of narrative we have to engage on the continent. So bring these Afro-champions, make sure that we communicate properly so that we create that space between the public and the private partnership to create that ecosystem. And through that ecosystem, provided everything is merit-based, talent is recognized, we should be able to see emerging more ALU across Africa.
Good. Sir in the red sweater.
Excellency, my name's Larry Domenici. I live here locally south of Boston. There have been numerous reports in the news about the condition of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. I was wondering if you could comment on the coral reef in Mauritius, whether or not it's similarly threatened, how that might impact the economy, and what mitigating factors perhaps the government is able to take or perhaps not able to take.
The Great Barrier Reef in Australia, we have seen recently, scientists have said that it has been a rise in temperature with the El Nino effect. We had this also a few years ago in the Indian Ocean, where the slight temperature rise, I think it was only about 0.5 degrees or even 0.5 in 1 degree, it was enough to cause the bleaching of the coral. But now we also are confronted with another challenge, which is the climate change, and increasingly people look at the ocean as a dumping ground, and they think that it can absorb all the carbon dioxide, but increasing the carbon dioxide will change the dynamic of increasing the acidity of the waters as well. So this also will impact the coral reef. And whomsoever talks about impacting the coral reef also talks about impact on livelihoods, because small islands like, for example, Mauritius and all the countries, of course, next to the ocean, will suffer the loss because artisanal fishing, for example, happens in the lagoon where a lot of these fishes are. So the impact is going to be, of course, having this ripple effect. But it's again an issue that we can't tackle alone. We can't, because climate change, providing all these, issues about rising decreasing pH, and of course rising temperatures, it's a global phenomenon. So we have to act globally, and unfortunately, we do not have all the tools to mitigate all these. So, and of course, whomsoever talks about a dead coral reef with all the appropriate impact of tsunami, cyclone, and all the rest of it. The scenario is very much a doomsday scenario. Unfortunately, I don't have any positive answers there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
In the balcony.
Good evening, Your Excellency. My name is Farai Gundan, originally from Zimbabwe. I'm a Mason Fellow and an MPA student. My time is up at Harvard, and I will graduate May 25th and make room for the incoming class. Earlier this morning, you mentioned that you would not seek another term, and I commend you for that. Even though my heart says, please stay, because you're actually one of the good presidents. My question is actually controversial. Presidential term limits as far as Africa is concerned. What are your thoughts? What are the terms? And how do we enforce that, specifically for those amongst your peers that continue to stay on?
Well, I'm not staying on. No, I've said to myself, it sounds again cliche, I've had 3 lives, so I can think of a 4th one after this. No, but I think this issue of terms, and it has been a big debate on the continent, but at the end of the day, we have to put it to the people. They have to have the right of choice. And we can look at it from whatever perspective, but the fundamental issue rests with the public and whether they should have a right to choose. And if they choose the same people by virtue of the results that's happening, and maybe it is not the president they want, it's a president they need in a different context. So I think the choice has to come back to the democratic process. Democratic process may not be the best model, but I think it's the best one that we have so far until we find an alternative. So this has to go back again to the people for them to choose. Thank you.
Up here on the balcony.
Hello, my name is Karen Morty. I'm a junior at Wellesley College studying linguistics. As a woman and as a woman of Mauritian descent and a woman studying STEM, I'd like to thank you for your time here. My question is related to the role of language in Mauritius. Mauritius is a multilingual, multicultural country. Numerous studies have shown the importance of mother tongue education. And I want to know what your thoughts are on Creole as a language of instruction in Mauritian schools, particularly in helping to progress Mauritius and craft its own identity as a country in Africa.
Yes, we have, as you have rightly said, we are a population of many different, ethnic, whatever religious groups that live together. We all come from various parts of the world, so with a population of 1.3 million, we have already 14 languages which are spoken and taught in schools. These, to me, they are the ancestral languages which help add to the diversity of our people and, of course, retention of cultures and getting to understand how to operate in that space. Creole is the lingua franca. Everybody speaks Creole when they wake up in the morning till that night, and they speak, they dance, they sing, they do all sorts of things in that language. Do we need to have Creole as a medium for teaching? I've had Creole as a medium of teaching when I was a young child because it helps to understand the concept. But the question that we have to put, if we are to have Creole in terms of the medium of teaching, is that a good thing? I know some countries that had reverted back to their mother tongue as the teaching medium. Eventually, they had big problems further down the line. There has been experiments like this. So again, these are things that we have to really sit down and debate, but more importantly, learn lessons from where it has happened and whether it has worked. But for me, to use Creole as a medium to help the child understand a concept, all for it. Thank you.
Yes.
Excellency, thank you for being here. My name is Evan Bonzel, and I'm a sophomore at the college. In your address, you mentioned the issue of climate change and the potential negative impacts it might have on Africa and on Mauritius. And I was curious what your thoughts are on it. One of the sticking points in international climate negotiations has been whether developed countries should shoulder the entire burden in terms of carbon emissions reductions, or whether developing nations should also share that burden with developed countries. And I'm wondering where you think we should strike that balance.
Well, it all depends on how do we define the developed and developing. How do we separate these two? Because those countries which were not developed are becoming developed. And so again, these are the issues that we have to grapple with. But the fundamental issue rests with the fact that, first of all, we've had a Paris Agreement. We managed to bring everybody on board. It was consensual that all the leaders agreed that climate change is an issue sorry, that has to be addressed up front. We managed to get the famous ratio of 55 for 55 and beyond. And we're just hoping that the United States stays in that space for discussion. I think there is this consensus that it is happening. Now, should the developed countries shoulder all the blames? And I don't think we are in that frame just yet, because leading up to COP21, it was one of the rare occasions where countries had submitted voluntary contribution. It's the first time it happened. And even with a country like Mauritius, which we're very, very small, we also took the pledge, for example, to reduce, for example, 30% of the emission. So this is the very first time where this has happened. So people are taking it seriously. And if you come back again to the issue of developed and having polluted and developing having non-polluted, I don't think this should be in the debate. I think we should go for a solidarity to say, we have a problem. How best do you solve it? What are the tools? What are the technologies we bring on board to try and address this problem? Because it's a threat for humanity. We should go out of this frame of saying the polluters and the non-polluters and all that. No, we have a problem. We have to be consensual in terms of addressing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good evening, Your Excellency. My name is Serena Qasim, and I'm a senior at Tufts University. And I ask this question as a fourth-generation East African Indian. As president of an ethnically diverse nation, there are Indians, French, Chinese, Creole origin, how does Mauritius maintain stability and equality amongst the many different ethnic people? And how do you interact with your continental counterparts where ethnic diversity is a problem?
Sorry, can you just read the question
Sure.
slower?
Sorry. So as president of an ethnically diverse nation,
Yes.
where there are people from many different ethnic backgrounds, how does Mauritius maintain stability and equality amongst the many different ethnicities within the country?
When many other countries in the region, there's substantial ethnic conflict.
Yeah.
We, as I said, a very small country, and so we have a very diverse population. As I said, many different religious groups live next to each other. We take it for granted while we're living there that we don't appreciate the value. For example, I grew up with I celebrate Diwali, I celebrate Eid, I celebrate Christmas, I celebrate Easter, I celebrate everything. It's great fun. I know that Christmas I'll be getting gifts, and for Easter I'll be getting eggs and all these things. So we don't even think about it. It has been kind of incorporated into our DNA. But having said this, one is very wary of the fact that this can also provide the potential for cleavages in a society. And what I have tried to do, I'm very mindful of that this can happen, because this will be a threat to the economic development, because any investor who wants to come to Mauritius would like to have stability in the country and all that goes with it. So we cannot take this for granted. It is something that we have to work on. We have to engage in interfaith and intercultural dialogue. And this is something that I value, this diversity. And my mantra is all the time, our diversity is our strength. And we need to have all the main key players in all these groups sitting together and discussing and getting to know each other. Because we have been evolving in a society where we have made a business out of fear. And the fear comes from the unknown, because we don't know. And this, of course, provides all the necessary ingredient for instability and, of course, what we have seen. So we need to have this. We need to have this dialogue. We need to work on this social diversity. We need to work on making our social fabric stronger. It can only happen through dialogue. It can happen through culture, and this is again why European countries, for example, are going for what increasingly known as cultural diplomacy. Because a lot can be done through culture, the dialogue. But at the bottom of the bottom line is we need to get to learn to know each other, to value each other, and to appreciate the differences, but at the same time enrich ourselves through those differences. So there is no two-way, otherwise we'll be at war. And for a country like Mauritius, we cannot have such a war because there's no space to run, others we're going to see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up here in the balcony.
Hi, my name is Sarah Sarani. I'm a junior at the college, and it's an honor to hear you speak because I was actually living in Mauritius at the time you were elected. So it's wonderful to see a woman in science become president. Because of that, what advice do you have for women or young girls who are interested in science or politics but easily discouraged by current political tensions or male-dominated intellectual spaces?
For the young girl, to go out there. As I said, first of all, you have to instill in her the confidence to do it, because very often they fall by the wayside by the time they go out into this world, because it's not an easy world to operate in. And it is not as Cartesian as it would be when you're a scientist. So you have to, you have to see, you have to decide yourself what you want to do. And, but I think, again, it comes back to this issue of mentoring. How do we mentor these girls to make them aspire to position of power, not leadership, because you can become a leader by being an entrepreneur, but how do you aspire to become to that position of power? And this is a whole exercise of nurturing, of mentoring. And for me, at a personal level, my message is that for that girl growing up in the village where I grew up, is that yes, it's possible. It is possible to make it to the highest post in the land. It is possible to make it without a political training, background, you name it, whatever it is. So for me, that was the most important messaging that goes out. But how long you stay in that space, how do you do it, what kind of ethics you bring to that position, all down to the person in terms of strategic decision that person will take. And again, it all depends what you want to do in that space. So it's all up to you. But to get to that level, we need to encourage, we need to nurture, we need to mentor, we need to make them there. But we need to have many role models. And this is where, again, where there is an issue in terms of role modeling.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have time for just one more question, and that goes to you.
Thank you again for your time. My name is Grace Huang, just a local Boston resident. As someone who's a young non-African, what are the most important factors that we should be aware of when trying to build healthy relationships, whether they're private or through the public sector, when becoming involved in helping create sustainable change that is still very African-centric?
Good question.
Sorry, you said what are the changes you want to make, is that right?
How can people who aren't African help the African Independence and Development Project?
And
come on
still
board.
create it, you know.
Come on board.
Help us. Bring in the diversity that Asia can. And this is what we need. We need to enrich, we need to have more diaspora, more of the talent, more of this dialogue with the rest of the world, because Africa also has things to share to the world. So I think through this, again, I come back to the issue of diversity. Diversity, talent comes at individual level. And this is what we have to recognize. This is what the American dream was all about in the past. If you're good, you make it. But if you're good, you must be bringing added value to the discussion. So anybody who has anything to bring to the discussion table, very welcome. And we have to see how to factor in this diversity and make it work for one and all. And I think this is where, again, I mean, if you look at, we mentioned China earlier on, we mentioned India, for example, they're all there in that space in Africa, trying to make it happen. Good or bad, but it's there, they're there. So yes, welcome, come on board. Thank you.
Thank you. So this has been a wonderfully inspiring and hopeful presentation, and thank you very much for your time. It's especially welcome in this time when there's so much trouble all over the world in so many countries in the world, and thank you. And I hope that some of the people in this room will join you as partners in your incredible journey of independence, of discovery and of knowledge. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.